So let's generate our motivation. Really feel how our opportunity to do retreat now is dependent on the kindness of other living beings. When you think about it, it's really quite amazing that people offer food here, people prepare it. We have the luxury of meditating many sessions a day, studying, not having a lot of worldly work to do and a lot of distractions. And that situation comes about because we have the support and the help of so many other people who are giving us this opportunity. They do it with a mind of faith. They do it with a mind of rejoicing and a wish that we're able to purify and accumulate merit and deepen our understanding of the Dharma. So let's not take their kindness for granted and really be aware of it. And so make sure that our motivation is one of love and compassion for other living beings, and especially one of bodhicitta, seeking full awakening, so we can really repay the kindness of others in the best way. So let's make that our motivation for this evening and for the whole retreat. Okay, so we're on volume 1 of the Library of Wisdom and Compassion, called Approaching the Buddhist Path. And we finished chapter 3 in the last session, so now we're on chapter 4. And chapter 4 is changing the topic a little bit, because remember, this whole first volume is really an introduction, filling in some of the pieces and giving us the background that will be really helpful to us as we really go into the path and the various meditations. So chapter 4 is called The Spread of the Buddhadharma and the Buddhist Canons. And so it talks about precisely that. You know, it's about the history of the spread of Buddhism. And it also talks a little bit about what we mean by vehicles and paths, because that kind of gets interwoven with the history. So usually, you know, when you're studying the Dharma, you don't learn very much about history. You get some stories here and there about, you know, this and this practitioner and that practitioner, but you don't really learn anything about, how Buddhism spread, how it was practiced, how it developed, and how it was influenced by culture and history and climate and geography and financial structure and so many different things, yeah. And so sometimes we see Buddhism as, it's this independent thing, uninfluenced by other human endeavors, like politics. Well, that's not exactly correct, you know, because it exists with human beings, and human beings exist within, all these social systems and exist within an external environment. So all these things, these other factors, wind up influencing how Buddhism develops. Uh, even in something as simple as our robes, or as complicated as our robes. Uh, you know, if you look, the Buddhist traditions, basically everybody has different color robes. They all are somewhere around saffron, in that range, but they range from, maroon to bright orange to ochre. There's a huge color difference. There's a huge style difference, how the robes are stitched, although all of them have this patchwork design. Yeah. In China, actually, the robes are very often gray and black, not even related to saffron. So, all of this depends on the historical period and what people thought and what was going on at that time. Okay, so for example, in terms of the robes, at the Buddhist time, saffron was considered a very ugly color, and it was the color that all the other wandering mendicants wore. Because at the Buddhist time, there were so many different wandering mendicants who were followers of many, many different teachers and different philosophies. So all of them wore these rag robes that were somewhat saffron color. Okay? But when Buddhism went into China, saffron was the color that the emperor wore, and nobody else was supposed to wear it. So the Sangha couldn't wear saffron robes. Yeah? So there, gray and black were considered kind of ugly colors. And the Chinese Sangha adopted those colors. And they also adopted the style of some of the people from the court in like the 7th and 8th centuries, even though Buddhism came to China much before that. Yeah. So the whole design of their robes is completely different. Yeah. And then, of course, the robes went to Korea, and they got redesigned there. Okay. And even within Taiwan, when we go, we look, that they all look alike. But we've noticed, certain monastic groups stitch their robes in a certain way and have the button or the bow. The Koreans tie a bow, the Chinese have a button, and the different in Taiwan, the buttons are different. Everything, okay? The way the collar's stitched. So things you would only notice if you lived there, but that are very important to the people there. Okay. Meanwhile, when Buddhism went to Tibet, they didn't have the color dye, as I heard it, to make saffron. But saffron can also have this very dark maroon strand. So they had that dye, so everything became saffron. And then they invented the donka, with these fangs of the Lord of Death. Yeah. And the blue cord represents the kindness of the Chinese monastics who helped restore the ordination when it almost died out. So their robes developed in a whole other way, and then they have the big cape-like things that you wear, and even within the Tibetans, different monastic traditions fold their robes differently. Okay. And then you have some lay teachers wearing things that look like robes, but those people aren't monastics. and that gets confusing for everybody. So, you know, it's like, welcome to sentient being land. Yeah. And so, but my point is, things exist within a culture and within a historical time. And so we have to see them as such. Yeah. And especially, I think this is helpful being followers of the Tibetan tradition, because the Tibetans, they were never occupied by a Western power. So they never had the Western university system introduced to their country, as many other Buddhist countries did. So they have no idea about sociology, yeah, anthropology, history. They're not great historians, because their history operates on these 60-year cycles. And sometimes you're not sure which of the 60-year cycles they're talking about when you try and convert it to our dates. Yeah. So, the Tibetans don't have that idea of how religion and culture influence each other. This was never a department that they studied, because they didn't have the university system. It was just, they were focused on the Dharma, and that was it. And so if you ask Tibetans, what's culture and what's Dharma, they usually don't even think about that. Yeah. I mean, it's very rare to find a teacher, maybe now more among the younger Geshis, but certainly not amongst the older ones that I studied with. Was there any idea of, cultural influence? It was just what they had, and it was all Buddhism. Yeah, and then when you start learning more, then you learn that a little bit about the Bon, which was the shamanistic traditions that existed in Tibet before Buddhism came, and then you start to see how Bon and Buddhism influenced each other. Yeah, although it's not a widely discussed topic, but it's certainly there, and it made a big difference. Yeah. So, for example, things like Mo's, okay, the Tibetan, it's basically fortune telling, okay. It's a way of making decisions by asking different bodhisattvas or protectors or whatever, and the Mo's weren't done in India that I know of. They seem to stem from, a Tibetan culture that predated Buddhism. But when Buddhism came in, then they adapted those things, gave it a Buddhist meaning, put in Buddhist deities, and, and away it went, so that it became a practice done by Buddhists, but it wasn't a practice taught by the Buddha. It was something that came about due to the cultural influences of Tibet. Okay, so there's tormas. In India, the tormas, I think a lot of them were made of fish. Yeah. But when you went to Tibet, they didn't have many fish, so they made tormas out of sampa. When you come to the West, people don't have sampa, so you get a can of fruit. Yeah. So all these things are influenced by the culture. Yeah. And we are not always aware of that, and it's not taught because Buddhism is just seen as Buddhism. That's it. Yeah. And I say this because as a Westerner, going into the Tibetan community, it took me a really long time to adapt and adjust to some of the Tibetan ways of doing things, being a Westerner. So, for example, learning to sit for a long time, okay? And then when I went to Taiwan in 1986 to take Bhikshuni precepts, then there was Buddhism in Chinese culture. And a lot of the meaning was the same, but the external things were completely different. So I had finally mastered sitting for a long time in the Tibetan monasteries. And you go to Taiwan, China, you stand for hour after hour. You don't sit. You stand. The way of kneeling is different. Yeah, Tibetan kneeling is more crouching. Yeah, Chinese kneeling is more like the Christians do, with both knees on the floor. So I had to get used to a whole different way of things, and then different robes. Yeah, and then chanting in a different language. And even the great compassion mantra, the Long Chenresi mantra. Wow, it sounds really different in Chinese. How the Chinese pronounce Sanskrit versus how the Tibetans pronounce Sanskrit. Yeah, poor Sanskrit. You can't recognize it hardly in either one or the other because, and then you bring in as Americans pronouncing or Westerners pronouncing Sanskrit. Yeah. Okay. So you get all these kinds of things happening. And, so I spent a good deal of time when I was in Taiwan and also afterwards really thinking about what is Buddhism and what is culture. Yeah. What is Buddhism? What is culture? Mm-hmm. And what does all of that mean for us as people living in the West? Okay. So, yeah. So that's why I think it's important to learn something about Buddhist history and about the civilizations in which Buddhism existed before it came here. Yeah. Because a lot of people talk about American Buddhism. Yeah, I get asked a lot about, what do you think about American Buddhism? What's American Buddhism? Yeah. Well, do you think there's going to be an American Buddhism? No. I don't think there's going to be American Buddhism. I think we're going to have lots of different Buddhist traditions existing in America. And, Western culture will influence each one of them. But I don't think we're going to have one American Buddhism. I mean, come on. I don't think that's going to happen. And I don't think it would be good either. Yeah, I mean, what would American Buddhism be? Yeah. And yet, what do we have going on now? Many people who have different levels of knowledge about the Dharma teaching and changing things, and you wonder, are they changing just the culture or are they changing the meaning of the teachings? Yeah, because changing the package is one thing, changing the contents and the teachings is a totally different ballgame. Okay, so what's going on here? What is the culture that we can change? What are the teachings that, if we change, we're contributing to the degeneration of the Dharma? Okay, so something important to think about. So that's why I think learning about history and culture are quite important. Okay. Yeah. And also so that we know something about other Buddhist traditions. Yeah. Because, in Tibet, okay, it was Tibetan Buddhism. You went from one valley to the other. It was still, it differed, but it was still kind of the same. But here, we drive down the street and there's different Buddhist centers. They wear different clothes, they chant in different languages, they teach different things, they even bow differently. Yeah. And so here we are, and, we've got to work together with all these different Buddhist groups, and we've got to be friends. Yeah. So we need to know, how do you bow when you go into a Theravada temple? How do you bow when you go in a Chinese temple? Okay, so there's lots of etiquette things. I am certainly not expert in any of them, and I make a lot of mistakes. But it's good to know a little bit so that, yeah, it's good to know something. I find it very interesting when we go to our monastic gatherings. Many of the people from the Theravada, they'll say, "Oh, you Tibetans have so many rituals." Yeah, you do so many rituals. Well, actually, the Theravadas have a lot of rituals too. But the thing is, when you're immersed in a certain way of practicing, you don't consider your rituals rituals. It's just the flow of the day and how you do things. It's only when you go to somewhere where people do things differently that you think they're doing rituals. Okay? But when I stayed in a Thai monastery for about 2 weeks. Well, they have tons of rituals. Yeah, that you have to learn how to do this and that, and where to sit, and who to bow to, and oh my goodness. Okay, and so every tradition has these, different rituals that it does. Okay, so if we don't have an open mind, then we can easily become quite judgmental. Yeah, oh, look at those people. Why did they do that? I'll give you an example. When I was studying at Nalanda Monastery in France, Geshe-la was talking about how to do prostrations. Okay, so in the Tibetan tradition, you tuck your thumbs in because that's to show that you're holding a jewel, offering the jewel to the Buddha, and the jewel is also your Buddha nature. And then you cup your hands like that, okay? When you go down, you put your hands flat, okay? They say don't put them like that because then you'll be born as a duck, and don't put them like that because then you'll be born as a cow. And I remember when Geshe-la was teaching all of this, then we asked, and then the way you go down, you put your hands first, then your knees, then touch your head, and then push yourself up. So then somebody was asking Geshe-la, well, in most of the other Buddhist traditions, they don't cup their hands and put their thumbs in. Their hands are flat like this, and so, are they, because he was quite clear, you have to do the prostrations exactly this way. This was the right way to do them. And so somebody said, well, are they doing them the wrong way? Are they creating negative karma? Yes. And most of us went, no. How can you say that, another Buddhist tradition which comes out of its own culture and so does things in its own way. How can you say that, just because they hold their hands like this and not like this, that they're doing it wrong? Yeah. So, there are these kinds of things that I think we need to be pretty open-minded about and also very flexible. Yeah. So, okay, so I'll start reading in chapter 4. not all people think alike. That's a great way to start a chapter. Yeah. And this is something that we need to really remember wherever we go. Not everybody thinks alike. They have different needs, interests, and dispositions in almost every area of their lives, including religion. In this light, the Buddha, a skillful teacher, gave multiple teachings to correspond to the variety of sentient beings. As the Buddhadharma spread across the Indian subcontinent and into other lands, people had access to different sutras and found certain teachings more suitable for their minds than teachings in other sutras. Yeah, that makes sense, doesn't it? First of all, we know in India there were so many sub-ethnic groups, and different kinds of people. And the Buddha really spoke according to the audience he was teaching. Yeah. And then when you have Buddhism going out to other lands, then of course different people think differently. Different cultures emphasize different points. So they're going to pick out different sutras and different teachings to emphasize in that culture. That's why you see in Buddhism coming to the West, many of the teachings about psychology being emphasized in Buddhist Dharma centers. Why? Because psychology is a big thing in the cultures nowadays. Okay? In this way, multiple Buddhist traditions came about. The development of these traditions and their presentation of the teachings were also influenced by the economic and political situations in each land, as well as the climate, social structure, language, and culture of each place. While all Buddhist teachings share the four truths, their selection of texts, their imagery, rituals, textual interpretations, points of emphasis, and religious institutions were influenced by the society in which they were produced. Okay? So we can see that very clearly. In Theravada countries, they have a Sangha Raja. Okay, so Raja is like the king, so the leader of the Sangha. In some countries, the Sangha Raja is, very closely related to the secular government of that country. And the secular government of the country, like in Thailand, has influences Buddhism in that country, even though, from the viewpoint of the Buddha, he wanted Buddhism and, the Buddhist legal system completely separated from the secular one. But in Thailand, they're like this. Okay? So, for example, in Thailand, there's a secular law that monks cannot ordain nuns. Give them bhikshuni precepts. Yeah, the government made that law. Okay, actually, that should be something that comes from the Sangha. The government also decides who can be a preceptor. They probably do that by recommendations from the Sangha hierarchy. But you have to be certified by the Thai government in order to be a preceptor. Whereas in Vinaya, if you have completed a certain number of years of ordination, then you follow the other Vinaya requirements, then you're suitable to be a preceptor. You don't need the approval of the secular government. So you have that kind of thing going on in Thailand. That started middle of the 19th century. Yeah. And when the Thai government, kind of took control over all the outlying areas and started influencing and setting up a whole education system that got standardized, in Tibet, then you had the Dalai Lama in charge of the secular government. starting from the 5th Dalai Lama. But before that, you had other monks, first from the Sakya tradition, then from the Kagyu tradition, now the Gelug, the very first ones were Nyingma, who are all involved in the government. And people see the position of the Dalai Lama, Westerners see the position of the Dalai Lama very much like a pope. He's nothing like the Pope. He does not have the authority of a Pope. Okay? He cannot set things and then impose them on all the Tibetan traditions. Each of the 4 traditions functions on its own. And within each tradition, the monasteries have a lot of, a lot of freedom, to set their own rules and do things their own ways. Okay, and then in Chinese Buddhism, they got completely away from the government. They didn't want to get sucked into the government, so they went to the mountains, and you got the Chan meditators in the mountains, who refused to do anything with the government. And so then Chinese Buddhism has a certain relationship with the government, whereby, you have to keep the government happy, otherwise the government turns against you, but you don't want to get involved in the government. So there's a lot of things going on. Each country, each kind of Buddhism is quite different. In Japan, again, the secular government, in the Meiji Restoration in the middle of the 19th century, they said all the Sangha has to, they can't be celibate. They wanted to break the power of the Sangha, so they said, you can't be celibate anymore. This was the government that said that. Okay? So you have all these kinds of influences going on in Buddhism in all the different places where it's at. Okay. So I don't know about you, but I find this quite interesting to think about, because it helps me put in perspective what I'm learning. And why certain things are emphasized, and why different teachings fit different people's mentalities. Okay. Knowing the history of the Buddhadharma is important to avoid absorbing sectarian biases that have been passed down for centuries. It also aids us in understanding why Buddhism developed the way it did in different places. This, in turn, stimulates us to discern the actual Buddhadharma from cultural overlays, so that we can practice the true Dharma without confusing it with cultural traditions. Okay, quite important. So, you have, like in Chinese communities, people doing feng shui. Feng shui is not Buddhism, but many Buddhists do it. Then is it going to develop where now people start thinking, well, if you're Buddhist, you have to do feng shui? Because they're so close together, and some Buddhist masters do that. Do people think that because you're now a Buddhist, you have to throw mows and make decisions by mows? So you see, we have to learn how to discern these different things. Learning about the history of Buddhism helps us to see Buddhism as a living tradition that influences various societies and is influenced by them. We come to differentiate the 3 jewels that are perfect objects of refuge from religious institutions established by limited human beings. And for me, this was a huge thing for me, learning that these are 2 different things, because the way it was presented, the way I learned it from the beginning, you know, Buddhism and Tibetan religious institutions and Tibetan culture and everything, it was all union oneness. Okay. And then I had to see, no, you know, religious institutions are set up by human beings. Yeah. The true Dharma that we are there to practice was taught by the Buddha. Okay. So yeah, we have to establish what's our relationship with the Dharma that we practice, and what's our relationship with the Buddhist institutions, and especially as foreigners, what's our relationship with the Tibetan Buddhist institutions, or with Chinese Buddhist institutions, or Thai Buddhist institutions? Yeah, how do we fit in there? And so it's quite interesting to see, for example, in the Theravada traditions, many of the Westerners, I mean, the Western monks, they got completely absorbed into the Thai Buddhist traditions, you know, and many of them are, you know, for example, the Thai government is the one who affirms them as preceptors. They have to follow certain things, you know, the regulations set up by the Sangha Raj and all in Thailand. And they're very much welcomed into the culture and supported by the culture. Okay. In Tibet, yeah, we're outside the Tibetan Buddhist institutions. Yeah. Some monks, you know, may study at the monasteries, but they don't have any role aside, you know, going up the Tibetan hierarchy. And, you know, I mean, there is one Westerner who's an abbot of one of the monasteries now. But aside from that, you know, we are apart from the Tibetan religious institution. Yeah. And at first I felt very kind of hurt by that. I wanted very much to be part of it. And now I realize actually that it's a blessing because we have the ability to do things according to our culture. If we were part of the institutions, it would, it would be quite difficult. For example, we have fully ordained nuns here. If we were accepted as members of the, if we were in the Tibetan religious institutions, then we couldn't do that. But, we're foreigners kind of out there somewhere. And they're, our teachers are so incredibly benevolent and gracious in teaching us the Dharma and ordaining us. But, aside from that, we're not going to play any role in their institutions, except maybe writing letters for them in English and helping with fundraising and stuff like that. But if you want to do that. But, we're not really accepted by them. And that is, I think, for us, very good, because then, at least here at the Abbey, we were able to go to Taiwan, take the Bhikshuni ordination, come back, practice as a fully ordained Sangha, do all the Vinaya rites. And, the Tibetans don't say anything about it. Our Tibetan teachers come here, they see people practicing the Dharma harmoniously. They're fine with the whole thing. If we were part of the institution, it wouldn't be so good. Okay? So, yeah. Okay. So I'm just sharing some of my ideas and experiences. Some of you may have had different experiences or different ideas. Okay. While the Dharma jewel goes beyond space and time, Buddhist institutions are not refuge objects. Yeah, although they do their best to serve the Dharma. Yeah, so the institutions are set up to serve the Dharma, to help preserve the Dharma, to organize the people who follow the Dharma. Okay, but the institutions are not our objects of refuge. When we do the refuge ceremony, as some of you did at the end of the course, it's very clear. You take refuge in the three jewels, in the Buddhas, in the Dharma, and in the Sangha. Okay? You do not take refuge in a particular Buddhist tradition. Yeah, that may be shocking to some people. Yeah, the refuge ceremony does not say, I take refuge in Tibetan Buddhism, or I take refuge in Galu Buddhism, or I take refuge in Sarah Monastery Buddhism, or I take refuge in Sarah J Monastery Buddhism. You just take refuge in the three jewels. That's it. Okay? And that's universal across all the Buddhist traditions. So the institutions are to help sustain the Dharma. Of course, institutions, they're founded by human beings. You have politics. Yeah. You have different things going on. Yeah. If you read Tibetan history, oh my goodness. Because most people have the image, Tibet is Shangri-La and everybody's holy and everything. And it's true. I mean, they have an extraordinary number of holy beings coming out there from the country. Okay. However, yeah, it's a society like all others. And there's this one book about Tibetan Buddhist history. What was it? Until 1911? Something like that. It was written, Gelek Rinpoche helped to write it. And then, what was his name? The other guy. He's from Chase Western University. Marvin something. Anyway, this thing of, any Tibetan history book, it reads like a murder mystery. It's amazing. It's shocking. Yeah, it's shocking. But in many ways, I mean, how many Dalai Lamas did not make it to maturity and died young? Yeah. When the fifth Dalai Lama died, his attendant did not tell anybody for 25 years. Because they were building the Potala Palace. And if it came out that the fifth Dalai Lama had died, people would have lost their energy to build the palace. So Sangye Dese just kept it going, that the fifth Dalai Lama was alive until the palace was completed. Then it was announced that he had passed away. And this was why things were so problematic with the sixth Dalai Lama, because nobody looked for the child when he was young. They only found him when he was older, and he was the sixth Dalai Lama was the one who used to go down to the taverns and brothels in Lhasa. Okay. So what? Yeah, so you're shocked. But, this is... human beings are human beings, okay? So this kind of romantic idea that we have that everybody who's Tibetan must be holy, it's a romantic idea, okay? Is it a correct assumption? I don't think it's even that, okay? But it's very popular in the West, okay? Okay, so I'm not putting anybody down. I'm just saying, we have to have our feet on the ground when we're practicing and know what is Buddhism and adhere to that and not change it and make a mess of it, and know what are religious institutions and what are political things going on, and deal with them very gingerly and only as necessary, and otherwise stay away. That's my philosophy. I do not want to get involved in any political discussions, around Tibetan politics. And anyway, the Tibetans don't want me to have opinions about that stuff. Yeah. Yeah. Yes, that's it. Melvin Goldstein. Yeah. But it's fascinating. Yeah, read that book. I couldn't put it down. I swear it was better than Nancy Drew. It rivaled Sherlock Holmes. Yeah. I can't remember. It was something about, and it has 1911 in the title. But if you look up Marvin Goldstein, and Gallic Rinpoche, Melvin. Yeah, Melvin Goldstein, thank you. I know it started with an M, Michael, Melvin, Martin, Marcus, something like that. Okay. And so I have actually the same philosophy about religious institutions in the West here. Let's keep everything as simple as we can and not get into complicated things. Okay. But let's work together. And that's what I really like about our monastic gatherings that we have every year of the Sangha that lives in the West. Because we don't present papers and we don't make decisions, but we become friends. And it's wonderful to be friends with these people from other Buddhist traditions. And then, like when I was setting up the Abbey and I needed advice, I had lots of people to ask advice from. And they gave me very good advice, which was practical to our situation here. Okay. All Buddhist traditions have their own accounts of Buddhist history. Am I supposed to say that? Everybody has their own account of history, don't they? Each country has their own account of history. Yeah. It was very interesting when I was in Russia, how Russia sees World War II. It was called the Great War, right? Yeah. And it was very much how Russia survived the onslaught from Nazi Germany, and it was horrible, it was like what was going on. Many people were killed, and Russia was really fighting for its life in the war. In the West, we look at World War II, and at least on the West Coast, we often think of Japan. Yeah, we think of Pearl Harbor. Okay, so everybody has its own way of looking and describing what the history is and what happened and what were the predominant things that were going on. Yeah. I mean, in Eastern Europe, it was all about, are you a country or aren't you a country? Because many areas of Eastern Europe, after World War I, they had become countries. Then during World War II, they were taken up again. Then maybe afterwards, they became countries again, So if you go to, the three Baltic nations, their view of World War II is going to be very different. Okay, than, for example, in France, where you had the Vichy government. Okay, so so each Buddhist tradition has their own account of Buddhist, the history of Buddhism. And of course, each tradition places themselves as the center, as the one group that holds the true Buddhadharma, more so than the other groups and the other countries do, right? Okay. Okay, so all Buddhist traditions have their own accounts of Buddhism's history, the place of their own tradition within that, and the authenticity of their own and others' scriptures. Woo! People have so many opinions about this and so many wrong ideas and so much sectarianism because of it all. Yeah, and this is really a pity, I think. These are generally based on oral tradition that was written down in later centuries. Okay, so you have what actually happened, which nobody really knew. Then, nobody really knows what actually happened. And anyway, even at the time it was going on, you would get so many different opinions of what was going on. If anybody asked what's happening in this country now, if you went to different parts of this country and asked, you would get totally different opinions of what's going on. Yeah. Except I think everybody now agrees that the government is shut down. Going into the third week of the government shutdown with no end in sight, So, but then everybody has its own opinion about what causes that and what it means. And okay, so you have that. Then you have what people recorded as history later, which is usually based on whatever group came out on top, whatever thing lasted longer. And then as history goes on, it gets rewritten again according to what goes on in each country and what points you want to emphasize and so on. So, for example, now in Poland, the government passed a law that you cannot say that the Poles had anything to do with the Holocaust. You cannot say that they had any responsibility for the Holocaust. Yeah. So they're putting it all on Germany, even though a good chunk of the concentration camps were in Poland. Yeah. Auschwitz, for example, was in Poland. Okay. But so the things get rewritten as time goes on according to the needs of the present people. Okay. So we never really know what happened, and everybody rewrites history in their own way. I was a history major in college, so this is, and I like humanities and liberal arts, so that's why I'm talking about this. If I had majored in science, we would have been done with this chapter already. Okay. But to me, history, sociology, anthropology, it tells you how human beings think, how human beings operate. And that interests me a lot, and to me it relates to the Dharma. Okay, so you have Buddhist history according to each tradition and each culture's version, Buddhists. And now we also have modern academics. Okay. And modern academics, the way they got involved in Buddhism was mostly through Sri Lanka. Yeah. And British academics going there, and Colonel Alcott, and And so he presented to the academics, the Western academics, Theravada Buddhism as, no mythology, completely rational, like that, very, very suited for the Western mind, no stories of miracles and, well, if you live in those countries, lots of stories of miracles. Yeah. Lots of stories of exorcisms and all sorts of mythology and supernatural things going on. But Colonel Olcott and the first academics, that's how they learned Buddhism. So of course, the Theravadas thing that, as passed down in their history, that the Buddhist word is encompassed in the Pali Canon, and the Mahayana Sutras were made up afterwards. So all of Western academia has been influenced by that. Yeah, and now it's interesting because some of the modern academics are starting to change their view about Buddhist history as they're learning more about other Buddhist traditions and as they're discovering more of these scriptures and artifacts from previous Buddhist cultures. Yeah, so the whole view of Buddhist history is beginning to change. Yeah, quite interesting. Yeah. Okay, so modern academics employing tools and methods of historical research that are not used in the traditional presentations of Buddhist history also have their views. Okay, so even dating when the Buddha lived, everybody has their own views. We'll come to that. Okay. While traditional accounts do not change with time, the views of academics change as new discoveries are made. And of course, the academics have their own prejudice and their own opinions. Okay. And, they'll take scriptures that we study from the masters that will take us years to study. And, some of the Madhyamaka material, it's so difficult and complex, and you have to study it for a long time, think about it for a long time. And Western academics will pick up a book and read it and write their own commentary and say what they think these things mean, based on what previous academics said. So they have their whole own discussion about the meaning of Madhyamaka in Western academia, which is different than what's going on in the Tibetan community, for example, yeah, or how they view Dharmakirti. Yeah, one Western academic, somebody was telling me that how Western academia interprets Dharmakirti is like totally different than how the Tibetans do. Yeah, so it's just interesting. Yeah. And I think it's good for us to know many different viewpoints, personally. Speaking of the various Buddhist traditions and teachings can only be done in a general way. As we know, people don't always fit into neat categories with well-defined borders. As in Buddhism, one teacher, many traditions, we will speak of two principal Buddhist traditions according to the language they came to be written in, the Pali and Sanskrit traditions. The Buddha himself taught in some form of Prakrit, a group of languages spoken in India by the common people of his time. After his parinirvana, the discourses were collated into groups and passed on orally for several centuries. Okay, so we're naming the two major Buddhist traditions after the language that most of their scriptures were in, Pali or Sanskrit. The Buddha didn't speak either of those. The Theravadas say the Buddha spoke Pali. Actually, he didn't. He spoke Prakrit. Okay. which was, the language. And there were many dialects, many forms of Prakrit. You cross a river and the language is different. Yeah. Okay, after his parinirvana, the discourses were collated into groups and passed on orally for several centuries. Okay, the earliest written texts we have date from around the 1st century BCE. So if you place the Theravadas place the Buddha in the 6th century BCE, the Mahayana mostly in the 5th century BCE, and everything was passed down orally, at least in the Theravada, what became the Theravada. It didn't have the name Theravada at that time, until the 1st century. Yeah, so here you have for 4 or 5 centuries, the whole thing was oral. And it's really remarkable how similar the scriptures are in the different traditions, considered that everything was passed down orally. Yeah, it's totally remarkable. Yeah. Okay. Both Pali and Sanskrit emerged as primary languages for transmitting the words of the Buddha. But that was a few centuries after the Buddha lived that happened. The Sanskrit tradition, as we describe it here, also includes texts in ancient Central Asian languages, such as Gandhari. Yeah. But before exploring the historical development of these traditions, it is helpful to be acquainted with the spiritual vehicles that they teach. And then we go into a section here on vehicles and paths. Okay, so to me, when I look at it, like you take there's scholars now looking at the Vinaya, that there's 3 extant Vinaya versions. And it's remarkable how similar they are, considering that it was an oral tradition for 4 or 5 centuries at least, probably longer in some areas. And that even when it was printed and written afterwards, the chance of making errors, as we all know from copying things out, you make lots of mistakes. I mean, do you ever proofread what you type? Yeah. I mean, even with the books I do, we read things again and again and again, and there's still mistakes and typos. So considering all of that, it's really remarkable how similar things are. Yeah. Okay. Any questions or comments so far? Yeah.
I was wondering what you thought about talking about methods of academia. I was wondering what you thought about how they do the text analysis. What your thoughts were on that. I'm trying to remember the name of the book. All the best men.
Oh,
I remember that's not right.
Yeah, the good men.
And also like
something.
Nico
Yeah.
Analio's,
Yeah, she. That was Jan Nattier,
yeah, right.
and analyzing the Sutra of Urga. Yeah, and All the Good Men, I think was the name of it. Yeah. So textual analysis, that was your question? I think it's interesting. I mean, this is what the Tibetans do, and I mean, each tradition has its own system of textual analysis. So I find it quite interesting to read what in some topics what Western scholars say. I found Jan Nattier's book particularly interesting because that sutra was one of the first known Mahayana sutras. And so it talks about, in it, you can see the relationship between the people following the Shravaka vehicle and the people following the Bodhisattva vehicle. And this was before Mahayana really was separated out as its own teaching. Yeah. And so the people from, they lived together, they practiced together, and that sutra, shows that. So I found it quite interesting to read that. On some other things like Madhyamaka, I don't tend to read scholarly materials. I'd rather study from my teachers. But other topics I think are quite interesting, to learn Tathagata, yeah, or even Chittamatra. It's different in Chinese Buddhism than it is in Tibetan Buddhism. Yeah. And so it's interesting to study things from the viewpoint of more than one school. And then, of course, to see what the academia says on some of these issues. Yeah. Anything else so far? Yeah? Oh, but I should say not all the academics agree either. Okay.
Is language Prakrit still alive?
Pardon me?
Is Prakrit still a language?
Is Prakrit still a language? I don't think so. Yeah.
Another one is when you spoke about the religious institution, to separate that from the...
Please enunciate.
Then you speak...
Remember, I don't understand things so well. No, just say it. It's my hearing, and I'm asking you to help.
When you spoke about religious institutions
Mhm.
and the 3 refuges, to separate that, I was thinking about problems that could arise within institutions, and then some people turn away from institutions because, and they melted with, kind of expecting something from the institutions that only the 3 jewels can actually deliver.
Yeah.
If they
Right.
take refuge.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And it's really sad when that happens. Yeah, when because of a scandal in an institution, then people equate the institution with the teachings and turn away from the Dharma altogether. That's really quite sad. Yeah. And that's why I think it's important separating those two things. But you can also understand how some people, if they go in, well, you people are teaching this, so you should practice what you teach. In one way, that's a quite reasonable expectation. Yeah, if you're teaching that, you should practice it. On another level, sentient beings are sentient beings, and they don't always live according to their highest values and highest goals. And their minds get overcome by afflictions. Yeah, and so that's why I think it's so helpful, if we keep our refuge with the 3 jewels like that, then even their scandals, we don't lose our faith. Okay, because we see that the scandal is a result of people not following the teachings that the Buddha gave. It's not a fault of the Buddha or the teachings the Buddha gave. Yeah.
Have you read anything about how the Bodhisattva vehicle became prominent and how the Arhat vehicle sort of
I've
became
read
less
some things about it, and there's lots of different theories. Yeah, some people trace it back to the Second Council, which was like, I don't know, 150 years or something like that after the Buddha lived. Then other, like just the version of what happened at the Second Council, there's very different versions of it. Yeah, so some people trace it to that. Other people, said it came later. It was actually a whole gradual process. It wasn't like, someone came along one day and said, okay, Now we have Mahayana Buddhism, and here are the Mahayana Sutras, and this is what they believe, and this is how we're different from, the fundamental vehicle. It's not like that. It was something that happened very gradually, very organically over centuries. Yeah. And His Holiness's view is, of course, that the Buddha actually taught the Mahayana, but it was kept very quiet for many centuries because it was only suitable for the minds of some people. Yeah. And then it became prominent later on when the time was ripe and more people would be receptive for it. Okay, but when it started out, it was just, like a slightly different tendency in how you practice. And then it was more a motivation. And then it became affiliated with some scriptures. But even the different Mahayana scriptures, there's a whole development in them. And then it became a whole separate tradition. Yeah. And even this thing about, as we did in this book and in Buddhism, One Teacher, Many Traditions, saying the Pali tradition and Sanskrit tradition, it's really very confusing because both traditions teach the three vehicles. Yeah, the Shravaka vehicle, the Pratyeka Buddha vehicle, and the Bodhisattva vehicle. So some people say, oh, Pali tradition, you mean Theravada. Well, no, it's not equivalent to Theravada. Yeah. Or even if you do mean Theravada, if you trace the history of Theravada, there's a Bodhisattva tradition in those scriptures too. And as we know in the Sanskrit tradition, there's all the teachings of the fundamental vehicle too. So, sometimes people divide it that way. And then you get, there's so many vehicles and so many names, and it's really not very easy. And some people are allergic to some names. Like you just say Mahayana and some people go, ugh. If you say Bodhisattva vehicle, they're okay. But if you say Mahayana, they're not okay. But Mahayana itself is much more a product of the Sanskrit tradition, whereas Bodhisattva vehicle is included in the Pali tradition. And the fundamental vehicle is found in the Pali tradition and the Sanskrit tradition. And the word Hinayana is banished. Okay? His Holiness has banished that word. And I am completely in agreement with that. Because nobody identifies as Hinayana. Nobody says with pride, I am a Hinayanist. Yeah? Okay. So if nobody identifies as it and it's used as a derogative term, then let's get rid of it. Even though it's found in many of the Mahayana sutras. So His Holiness uses the term fundamental vehicle instead. But the fundamental vehicle is not equivalent to the Theravada. Okay? And the Mahayana is not equivalent to the Sanskrit tradition. And then you have Tibetan Buddhism and Chinese Buddhism and Korean Buddhism, and how do they fit in the mix? Yeah, especially in Chinese Buddhism, where you have some sub-schools that are more Mahayana leaning and some that are more fundamental vehicle leaning. Okay, so it's the names it's really a mess. Yeah, it's really a mess as far as I'm concerned. Any other questions? Should we go on? Yeah?
Since you've been doing this
Oh, wait.
This is coming up in the book, but I'm curious about the criteria you've used since the early days of your ordination of figuring out what's Buddhism and what's culture, because at first it was, you didn't really know, right?
Yeah. So the criteria I've used, 4 truths, 2 truths, 3 higher trainings, Noble Eightfold Path, 3 principal aspects of the path. Those, all the teachings that are taught in those kind of ways of dividing things. Sutra and Tantra. So that's what I've basically used. But of course, because they're living traditions, it's not always clear what's what. Okay. Yeah. Like, especially when you come to Tantra, okay, or Tibetan Buddhism, like I was saying, how some Buddhist elements got mixed with Tibetan culture. And I think the same thing kind of happened in Thailand, as far as I understand, too. Yeah. Like the thing prayer flags. Okay. How come you only find prayer flags in the Tibetan tradition? Yeah. That must have some cultural influence. Mm-hmm. Okay. The Tibetan thing, how they go up on the hill and you take sampa and you throw it and you make offerings to the gods and everything. That is something that came from Bon, but then they say you don't just make offerings to the worldly gods, you also make offerings to the Buddhadharma Sangha. So it got a Buddhist interpretation. Okay. So that, I try and look at the philosophy and then look at the rituals and and I use the philosophy much more as the criteria, not the rituals.
Venerable, what is your thoughts on pragmatic Buddhist groups? There's a pretty prominent pragmatic Buddhist group in Columbus. I've never been, but it's
pragmatic.
Pragmatic. They call themselves pragmatic Buddhists.
So what does that mean?
I don't know.
Oh, then I can't give you an opinion if I don't know what they mean.
Define it, I think. I think it means like rational. I'm not quite sure my definition.
I know there's a whole secular Buddhism.
Yeah, it says based on practical rather than theoretical considerations. Like, what does that mean in terms of Dharma? I mean, I don't know.
Yeah, I would have to read more and see what they believe. I can't on that description say anything. Yeah. Uh-huh.
So with these divisions and the 4 tenets, would then be the Vaibhashika and the Satantrika, would it be more Theravada?
Yeah.
But
The Theravada has some Vaibhashika and Satantrika tenets, but you can't equate Theravada with either Vaibhashika or Satantrika. Yeah, it doesn't fit in either category. And also, this is a shocker. You know how the Tibetans say Vaibhashika is the big title for the 18 sub-schools? No other Buddhist tradition agrees with that. They say the Vaibhashika are some small break-off from the Sarvastivadis. It's not even the major thing, a major school. It's some small thing. But the Tibetans say, oh no, it's the big thing that encompasses the 18 schools. Okay? and when you look at the 18 schools, there's so many different versions of them. Everybody talks about 18 schools. I mean, the Chinese do, the Theravadas do, Tibetan, everybody talks. Their lists of the 18 schools are very different. Even in the Tibetan tradition, there's about 4 different lists of what the 18 schools are. And when you count up all the things of the 18 schools, there's many more than 18. But everybody says there's 18 schools and produces a list. And they're subdivided usually into 4 different categories, but sometimes it could be different. Yeah? So it's quite interesting. And also, the Mulasavastavadas, which the Tibetans make a big deal out of because that's their Vinaya tradition, and also a lot of the, the Dura texts and things like that. Again, there's some small branch of the Sravastavadas, Hardly anybody knew about them. They came centuries later than the other, most of the other 18 schools. So, go figure. Yeah.
But could you say that the Chittamatra and the Madhyamika are definitely not found in the Theravadan tradition? Could you make that distinction? I need clarity.
Madhyamaka, I would not say that. If you read some passages in the Pali Canon, they sound very Madhyamaka.
In the Theravadan tradition.
But the Theravadas hold the Pali Canon.
But you said that the Theravada and the Pali tradition, there are also differences.
Because the Pali tradition includes a bodhisattva vehicle. I don't know if the Theravadas themselves say they include the bodhisattva vehicle or not. I mean, they say that the bodhisattva vehicle exists, but the early people in that tradition, they practice some bodhisattva stuff. I mean, very much actually in Sri Lanka. Yeah. And Dharmapada in the 6th century put together this treatise, the treatise on the paramis, or paramitas. And it lays out the bodhisattva vehicle according to the Pali tradition. Okay. Chittamatra is more in China and Tibet, but it's not the same in China and Tibet. What they say Chittamatra is very different. And I think what we learn as Chittamatra is the Tibetans' interpretation of Chittamatra. And what they say that a Sangha, if you follow a Sangha and you really think about it, a Sangha would say da 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 da, and so that's what Chittamatra is. But a lot of what we learn isn't stuff that actually came from a Sangha and Vasubandhu itself. It came from Tibetan commentators describing what Chittamatra is. And then the Chinese talk differently about Chittamatra. Yeah. I mean, it's really fascinating when you get into it. But regarding Madhyamaka, I think, if you look at Nagarjuna, he was very early on. He had access to all of the early sutras. And the early sutras in all the 18 schools were probably pretty similar. They had their differences, but they were all passed down orally. And it was only a few centuries after the Buddha. Okay. And so what you find, the first verse in the Karikas where Nagarjuna says, nothing is produced by self, other, both or causelessly. The same argument, I found it in 2 different Pali Sutras. Yeah? I mean, that's something that's basic to how Madhyamaka is taught in our tradition, and it's there in the Pali tradition. Yeah. And then there's other passages that I found. And I said, wow, this sounds like Nagarjuna. So it's quite interesting, you know. And I really wish I could do, I mean, I'm not one of these scholarly people. I'm just, you know, some Joe Blow, you know, Joanna Blow. You know, Joan Blow, whatever you call it, you know, Jane Doe, who's just reading. You know, I'm not a scholar who's looking at, you know, when this text was written and when that text was written and knows the both languages and comparing them. I'm not that. I'm just reading the English translations, but going, you know, there's a lot of stuff in common here.
So there's then some discussion about what tradition are we in the Tibetan Buddhism.
Okay.
So we being Sravasti Abbey, I guess.
We're the Sravasti Abbeyites. What tradition are we? I usually say our practice tradition is Tibetan. Our Vinaya tradition is Dharmaguptaka. Yeah. And among which of the 4 Tibetan ones? You know, when people ask me, I just say I'm a Buddhist. Yeah, they're shocked. I've gone into many different centers and, you know, what are you? Nyingmakarya Gilu Sakya. I'm a Buddhist. What? You know, you've got to identify. I mean, I love Jay Rinpoche. Yeah. But I have some resistance to creating identities. Okay? So, you know, I love Jay Rinpoche. I'm definitely a Jay Rinpoche follower. To say I'm this or that, you know, as one name, I have some resistance to that. Okay.
And somebody else asked, what is the name of the Pali text that discusses the Bodhisattva path that you mentioned?
Oh, the treatise on the paramis. And it's been translated into English. I think you should be able to find it on the web. It was written by Dhammapala. 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 Dhammappala.